So then, I think everybody probably has heard of the Arab Spring. And my question would be, why haven't we all heard about this Asian wave of uprisings at the end of the 1980s, when in 6 years, in 9 places, 8 dictatorships were overthrown. So it was much more successful than the Arab Spring, and arguably less driven by international geopolitical changes. In other words, driven from the grassroots, from ordinary people like ourselves deciding that they couldn't live anymore with the kinds of regimes that they had suffered for so long under. Obviously, one answer to the question is there's no oil in East Asia, or little oil in the region. Certainly Brunei has oil, the Sultanate of Brunei, and but for the most part, there's no oil in the region, and therefore, media attention, would be best called to that area for the immediate needs of the insane world system that we have that relies so much on oil and fossil fuel consumption, particularly for consumer automobiles, when it's just not necessary. It's just a waste, really, that drives not only environmental devastation, but also wars. And yet in Asia, in the last decades, with the Korean War and the Vietnam War, that's where the United States has killed more than 8 million people in wars that were never declared as wars by the US Congress, as stipulated in our Constitution. Asia has been the site not only of these US killing fields, but also of the most dramatic growth in the world system since the end of the Cold War. Asia's population and economy are very significant factors in the stability of the system. So, returning to the question though, why don't we know more about the Asian wave? I think a lot of it has to do with Eurocentrism. Now, I don't know who's in the room with Auntie, but I'm willing to bet you that almost every one of you knows something about the Paris Commune of 1871. And I'm also willing to bet you that very few of you knew anything at all about the Kuang Ju Uprising of 1980. Am I correct on that?
Yeah.
Yes? No?
Yes.
So, in my view, the Kuang Ju Uprising of 1980 is important for many reasons. Most importantly, for right now, because it shows how far advanced the popular movement from the grassroots is at the end of the 20th century compared to the end of the 19th century. By that I mean, if we look at the Paris Commune, that was led by an already formed National Guard in Paris, men in uniforms with guns, whose officers decided, the Central Committee of the National Guard decided to take over the city. And it was taken over with, at most, 3 fatalities, one being a general who refused to go along and was shot by some of the enlisted men immediately next to him when he tried to do something against the commune, and 2 of his officers, who again were just shot by men in the National Guard who were right there when they tried to stop the movement. The Kuang Ju Uprising seized control of the city by fighting over 15,000 of the most well-trained troops in the world and best equipped troops in the world. These were paratroopers, South Korean paratroopers, pulled off the front lines with North Korea, with the United States acknowledgement and support, and sent to Gwangju to quiet the protests against the new military dictatorship. So in Paris, the pre-existing National Guard seized power. In Gwangju, people formed their own fighting units in the heat of a terrible struggle. I mean, the military came in. I don't know that the slides fully explained it, but here's the situation. In 1979, the long-standing dictator of South Korea was assassinated by his own Korean CIA chief. There was a brief moment when Korean people thought they would have democracy, but unfortunately a new military dictator seized power. When protests against him ensued, he said if anyone stays in the streets, he would send in the army. Only in Gwangju did people remain in the streets. In Seoul, the student movement made a decision to wait, to not have protests. So he wanted to make an example of Gwangju, and he sent the military in. They went in first with bayonets and specially designed American clubs to break bones. Women, students were killed in the streets. Women were raped. Taxi drivers who stopped to take young people to the hospital were killed. City buses were stopped. People pulled out and beaten in the streets, stripped naked, made to stay in a prone position for hours and then taken off to camps, and many were tortured. The police chief objected. He was taken away and tortured. The head of the local military unit objected. Paratroopers landed behind his lines, took him away. So people at first, just from seeing and hearing about the brutalities, began to fight back with sticks and stones. Soon the first Molotov cocktails in modern Korean history were made. Then people, as they disarmed the military, seized weapons. People began to use weapons. Many police went over to the side of the movement and opened their armories to people. The miners in nearby Hwasun gave dynamite to people. So people then began to fight back in earnest, but the military used machine guns and flamethrowers, helicopters. People were beaten and began to fall back in the street. At that moment, over 100 vehicles who had autonomously assembled at the soccer stadium, mainly taxis, but also about a dozen buses, big buses, inner city buses, came up the main street, and something like 200,000 people fell in behind them and attacked the military. And in a night of heavy fighting, they defeated the military and seized machine guns and put these machine guns on high buildings in the downtown area and shot down a helicopter and compelled the military to retreat out of the city. So the city was liberated. People were astonished that they had liberated the city. So how did they govern themselves? Well, in front of the provincial capital, the state capital, is a big fountain, a circular traffic circle. People began to gather there, and the building itself was taken over, and various groups set up offices in the building. Across the way was a karate studio, and that became the morgue for the people to bring the dead and for families to identify the dead. High school girls organized themselves to collect the dead bodies and to wash them and prepare them for viewing before family members would find their loved ones looking, well, So people then just simply began to talk, a conversation. And soon somebody said, wait a minute, I can't, hear you. And they used a megaphone, and somebody said, look, let's come back in a couple of hours. Somebody figure out how to get a speaker system going, and we'll, tell everybody to gather here. And so there was a gathering. Over 100,000 people, then over 150,000 people. And at that gathering, you can imagine, some people said, we're crazy. What have you guys done? You know, we're all going to get killed. We should give up our weapons and, you know, beg for forgiveness. And the, you know, more militant people said, look, the reason we picked up the weapons is we were being killed. And if we give them back, they're just going to kill us again. And, you know, people said, well, what do you want? You know, and so people talked, blah, 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 blah. And anyone could speak. Old people, young people, female, I mean, everybody, prostitutes, gang members, the local gangs, you know, by that I mean more like mafia or yakuza, all came and pledged allegiance to the city and uprising. The city was united. It was called the community of love, the absolute community. Something I call the Eros effect. I had talked about this about 1968. And the people governed themselves through direct democracy for the entire time they had the liberated city. By that I mean difference was tolerated. For instance, at that first rally of over 100,000 people, two remarkable things occurred. First, they formulated three demands that they could all agree on. As long as they held the city, they demanded, and even after the city fell, they demanded, one, the military apologize and restore the honor of the families of people who had been affected, meaning they would not be discriminated against. In many Asian countries, if one member of the family does something considered a crime, then the entire family suffers. Two, they demanded that the families who lost loved ones or people who were wounded or even imprisoned or tortured or beaten receive compensation. And three, they demanded that the people responsible for the violence of the military be punished. So that was a consensus that was a reasonable thing for people to fight for. That's really what they united the city in terms of the specific demands. They, of course, also talked about wanting democracy in South Korea and many things. But the second thing that occurred was someone, and to this day I don't think anyone knows who, yelled out, look, because the older people were saying, let's give up all our weapons and surrender. And the respected citizens, that is, businessmen, priests, some professors, whereas the more militant people were saying, no, we're not going to give up anything. Someone in the back screamed, why don't we give some of our weapons to the military in exchange for getting prisoners released? You know, that hundreds of people, maybe thousands, no one knows for sure, were being held in a military camp, being beaten, tortured. So everyone agreed right away, that's a good idea. Who will go? They took, you know, three people, a student, a professor, and I think it was a priest. And they went, and within a couple of hours, before the rally broke up, they were back with dozens of prisoners. And the people had thousands of weapons by this time. Weapons were not in short supply. What was in short supply were bullets, were ammunition. So it wasn't, you know, to them, it wasn't a big deal to give up weapons. Some weapons. And obviously they chose which weapons to give up. But so the next day, 150,000 people gathered, and there were tens of thousands of people for the 5 days in which the city was held. All this time, fighting was going on, and the citizens' army, which formed, became increasingly organized. It went from being autonomous fighting units to a coordinated team effort in which the various teams took their own names, and elected their own leaders, to have leaders in the sense of being in touch with the province hall. You know, the province hall became the central place for the military defense of the city, for the, you know, citizens' army. It also was where all the various groups eventually had a place to meet. There was a group, for instance, that met at the YWCA. That was, let's say, longer-term activists There was a group from the Workers' Night School, the Wildfire Night School, that was publishing a daily newspaper. There was an artist group that was putting out posters. So there were many autonomous groups. The theater group, the local People's Theater Group, took charge of managing the rallies because they were very skilled at public speaking and relating to audiences. They were the kind of, you know, like the San Francisco Mime Troupe, if you know that, they're like, we call it guerrilla theater. But they went, they did certainly performances in cities, but they did a lot of performances just going to villages. The region of Korea where Gwangju is located, the southwestern corner, is the agricultural heartland of Korea. I mean of all of Korea, North Korea and South Korea. So obviously with North Korea being cut off from the agriculture in the south, there's a structural food problem right there. In any event, the Kuang Ju Uprising's heroism comes to the attention of the United States very quickly. They lie about what's going on, or they were lied to. They claim there were people's tribunals, that people were being assassinated, etc., you know, things like this. In fact, no one was assassinated, no one was imprisoned. There was no crime in the city, much like the Paris Commune. And in these other moments, crime rates plummet. This was a community of love. The United States basically orders the South Korean military to move in, sends in a U.S. aircraft carrier for support, and with helicopters, tanks, and troops, the province hall is retaken. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed in the entire time. But the thing is, and this is, I think, what's most important, not only did people fight to the end, but even after the so-called end, they continued to fight. They refused to submit. So when they were arrested, they sang movement songs. When they were brought into trial, they threw their chairs at the judge. And they continued to demand the same three demands that the direct democratic rallies had called for, which I had said to you, the apology, punishment of those responsible, and some kind of restitution. So they continued this. The military, of course, had covered up the uprising to the people of South Korea. Even though the revolt spread to 17 other small cities in that region, they had basically cordoned off that region, which historically is a very interesting area of the world for many reasons. There are more dolmen there than in the rest of the world combined. You know dolmen, they're the stone structures, sometimes two vertical stones and a pillar holding up a flat top, or sometimes one, sometimes three. So there are more dolmen there than in the rest of the world combined. There was 400 years ago an uprising of slaves led by a former gladiator, and they won a republic in which anyone, as they put it, could be whatever they wanted to be and do whatever they wanted to do with their life. They were ultimately overpowered, but that region has a long history of radical movements. It's also today not only the heartland of the political movement of democracy in South Korea, it's known as the best food in South Korea, and it's also the art capital of South Korea. It's where there's a biennale every couple of years. So that region was cut off by the military, and the rest of Korea was in the dark about the uprising. Some people, in fact, still don't have the facts straight about it. It's very interesting. And the right-wing media in Korea continue to try to say it was a North Korean plot, the Kuang Ju Uprising. Very few people believe that. In fact, the courts fined some newspapers for printing that because it's just so untruthful. That cover-up was also then a problem for the military. First of all, they used garbage trucks to dump bodies outside the city, and people turned that into a cemetery that became a mecca for people from all over Korea, activists especially, and now the world, to go to see the fact that yes, many people were killed. The media at that time said, the more police and soldiers had been killed by rioters, only a couple of rioters had been killed. So then when people were streaming to the cemetery, the military government tried to move the corpses from the cemetery. Family members then camped out at the cemetery to refuse permission to touch the corpses of their loved ones. So there was a long struggle for the cemetery. 5 years later, a book was published about the uprising. You can't imagine how the repression prevented word of the uprising from spreading even inside Korea. And yet the people of South Korea, by word of mouth, underground news, knew about it. And in 1987, there was an uprising for which Kuang Ju. There's a problem in the line.
Yeah. You should start again from the 87.
So, okay.
Yeah.
So that in 1987, there was an uprising, 19 consecutive days of illegal protests involving hundreds of thousands of people that compelled the U.S. and the South Korean military to grant direct presidential elections in South Korea. That uprising in 1987 was part of that Asian wave I began to talk about. Now, the Asian wave starts from 1986 to 1992, is inspired by Gwangju, but those 6 years begin with the Philippines, with the overthrow of Ferdinand Marcos, who had been a longtime dictator in the Philippines. Now, Marcos had assassinated Benigno Aquino, the father of the man who's now president of the Philippines. So Aquino had been living very near where I am, actually, in the next town over, Newton, Massachusetts. And so had Kim Dae-jung, the man who became later president of South Korea. But at the time, both were in exile. Both were, Aquino had been serving a long time jail sentence and was released for health reasons to the United States. Kim Dae-jung was actually sentenced to death and was released to the United States. Both were at Harvard, both knew each other, they had breakfast together at least one occasion at Aquino's house. From a witness I spoke with, Aquino's address book in the family museum in the Philippines had Kim Dae-jung's phone numbers in Boston and in Washington, D.C. in the address book, so I would assume they knew each other fairly well. So they obviously talked about Gwangju, and I think Gwangju can be seen as helping to inspire people power in the Philippines in 1986. And people power, of course, as we called it, became very well known. It was a media event, and it led to, within days of it breaking out, the Korean Catholic Church, because the Philippine Catholic Church was heavily involved in that movement. The Korean Catholic Church was calling for similar protests in Korea. So we had 86 the Philippines, 87 South Korea. I think Auntie showed you the slide of the wave, right? 88 Burma, 89 Tibet and China, 90 Taiwan, Bangladesh, and Nepal, and 92 Thailand. So again, why isn't this wave known? Eurocentrism, no oil. Part of it is, I think, also Asian humility. I think in the West, people have a tendency to want to or to be able to, show who they are, whatever, brag about who they are, puff their chests out, and stuff like that. I think in Asia, the tendency that people want to and do the opposite. They'll say things in very understated fashions. Bless you. And finally, the role of repression is very important. The role of repression in Asia, as I say, there are still people in South Korea who know very little about the Kuang Ju Uprising, simply because when they were in school, elementary, high school, college, it was simply not taught, not allowed, and the news media is very conservative. But there's a dimension of it that is psychological, I think, why we don't know about this wave. Uprisings are very bloody events, and we don't want to really think about them. It's, just as I think women who give birth to children, I've been told, somehow don't remember the pain and the agony they go through in labor. And I think it's a similar event where people who go through it suffer terribly and don't have the release that women have from the birth of the child. That there remains, the agony that people have. Some people are still in the hospital in Gwangju suffering from mental problems as a result of the trauma they suffered in the uprising. There are trauma centers that work with them that are funded by the city because it is a major problem. People who avoided, who said at the time, it's not a good idea, I'm not going to do anything, don't want to talk about it because they're ashamed of it. They're ashamed of their behavior. I can't tell you how many really good long-term activists I spoke with who told me how ashamed they were that they had gone underground. When the military came into the city, the night before, activists' homes were raided, and people, dozens, hundreds of people were arrested. So obviously word spreads, get out of town, they're going to come and look for you. People got out of the city and they could not get back in because of the military cordon there. Helicopter gunships controlled the highways coming into and out of Gwangju. One convoy that tried to get in was surrounded and captured, but others were simply shot up. And I think it's a very difficult thing to talk about either way, any way you look at it for people there. And for us in history, to look at our own history, there's a way in which we underestimate our own strength, our own power. I think, there have been, when we look at history since 1968, 1968 was a year of global uprisings, like no year since, let's say, 1848 or 1905, were similarly years of global uprisings. But after 1968, we have 5 moments of what I call the Eros effect. That is internationally synchronized popular uprisings from the grassroots, none of which are organized by any centralized party. So the 5 are, in 1982, the Disarmament Movement, which was an international movement, hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of Paris, Rome, Bonn, New York, London, because the US and the USSR had what they called medium-range nuclear missiles, which could have led to a nuclear exchange in which neither the US nor the USSR would be hit. And that movement helped to end the Cold War from the grassroots. The second wave, or Eros effect globally, is this Asian wave. This Asian wave is number 2. Then shortly thereafter, the wave in Eastern Europe that overturns old left governments, a third wave. The fourth wave is the wave around Seattle, when about a dozen elite summits were confronted. I bet some of you were at some of these protests against the G8, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, Prague. There were many protests, more than a dozen, but a dozen major ones. And finally, 2011, the Arab Spring, the Greek movement, Occupy Wall Street, which again, from the grassroots, spread all over the world. These are, it's a new kind of tactic that has developed by the popular movements themselves. It's not a general strike. It's bigger than a general strike. It's not an armed uprising. It's very different. It's unarmed occupation of public space. Popular movements themselves intuitively, emotionally know in their guts the time has come to act, and the way to act is to take control of public space. So you have, like as in the Kuang Ju Uprising, where people took control of the Province Hall and that square, you have that happening all over the world. Whether it's Tahrir Square in Cairo, or Gezi Park in Istanbul, or Tiananmen Square in China, in Beijing, or Shanghai Shek Square in Taiwan, or Patan, part of Kathmandu, a very old part where there's huge public areas in Nepal, so on and so forth, right? The popular movements know that seizing public space, or Occupy Wall Street, that was all about seizing public space in major cities. The commune, that's the form of this tactic that it takes. And again, not dictated by any party, but from the grassroots. It's not, it seldom wins, right? We seldom win fully. I remember many conversations I had with Vietnam veterans, right-wing Vietnam veterans, who insisted the U.S. won every battle in the Vietnam War. And of course, I would always say that may be right. It wasn't right, but that may be right. I didn't want to argue with them about Ap Pak or other battles. But okay, you may be right, but who won the war? And I think it's really a similar question that we need to ask ourselves, that we may not win these battles, but the war will be won eventually by a kind of democracy that is a much deeper and broader kind of democracy. And what passes for democracy now, I suspect we would all agree, is not real democracy. Certainly not in the United States, where you basically, it's a one-party state, where there are differences about, how much the rich should get and how little the poor should have, whether it's health care or other things. But they're all united on the question of empire, of, it doesn't matter about killing people internationally, they don't count anyway. This form we see in Oaxaca, in the teacher struggle, when people seized control of the city, right? Again, it started out as the workers, but it was the whole city. So the grammar of movements is not only about seizing the control of space, but in those spaces, direct democracy is the way in which people govern themselves and make decisions about the direction the movement should take. There's the self-organization, not organization by a party. The eros, that is, Herbert Marcuse made a very important insight into the character of contemporary society, the reduction of eros to sex, that is the commodification of the life instinct. And it's being turned into, sexual connections between people. When I say the eros effect, I mean solidarity in this broad sense of human love for humanity and for all life is awakened in us in these moments. And the wisdom may be the idea of the commune and direct democracy, but the feeling, the intuition is one of the universality, the love of life and of all humans. These are, this is the concrete form that freedom is taking in the world today, in the actions of millions of people. And their demands might seem modest, but the heart of the movement and the direction of the movement is for freedom, for unbridled freedom, and for the popular will to be enacted. So I would say that in the 1960s, we had struggles that were single issue. Whether it was racism, freedom for Vietnam, or being against the war in Vietnam. In the 1970s, there were anti-dictatorship movements in Latin America, anti-US imperialism, to be sure. There were anti-IMF riots in much of the world. In the 1980s, you had the Asian wave. But today, in the 21st century, all over the world, there are movements against the capitalist world system. People understand that that is the problem. That is what's causing environmental devastation. And, the dire predictions about environmental devastation aside, there's no reason for it. I mean, we have the technology. We just lack the political will in governments. So all over the world, there's an understanding that weapons of mass destruction should be abolished, not just in the hands of people the media labels as dictators, but in everyone's hands. Poll after poll shows people are against weapons of mass destruction. All over the world, we have these pockets of resistance and action occurring. I think one of the obstacles to the movements all over the world moving as far ahead as they could is the reification of theory from past movements. Reification means the process, Marx talked about how living life is turned into a commodity. Everything becomes a commodity, an object. Even labor power becomes a commodity to be bought and sold. But it also means revolutionary theory has been turned into commodities, that people turn into fixed things like Trotskyism or primitivism or syndicalism, or these then, because they divide internally within the movement as much as they unite like-minded activists, they create obstacles to the living development of revolutionary theory from the popular movements as they exist today. If we're taking fixed systems of thinking from the 18th, 19th, and even early 20th century, we're not doing justice to our own tradition. So this is perhaps another reason why we are not as conscious of this Asian wave, is the reification of past revolutions and revolutionary theory. I think I've talked a lot, Auntie, don't you think, people? Maybe you have some questions. Thank you for your interest.
So, any questions? If you want to ask, you have to come close to the microphone.
And by the way, you should ask Auntie how we met and where we've been together. Might be interesting.
How long have you two been together? I can tell this later.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Edgar. How are you?
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Sorry to meet you.
You said something very interesting. You said that people's movement were bigger than general strikes.
Yes.
If we look in the history, what people got doing general strikes, what the results that people got, doing general strikes in the history, in compare with the results that the people made by just people's movement, spontaneously people's movement. If you compare that, you would still say that people's movement, spontaneously movement, are bigger than a general strike?
Well, by bigger, I don't mean to imply general strikes are not important. But what I mean is broader, in terms of many types of people being involved.
Okay.
And when there is simultaneously a general strike and the seizure of public space, that's when movements achieve the most.
Yeah, I just understood that you said, I understood like that, that you said it was bigger than...
What I meant to say was they involve more kinds of people, they're bigger constituencies.
Yeah, that's...
But let's look at May 68 in France as an example of how during these popular uprisings, trade union leaders hold back their forces. Because the general strike and the popular uprising are seen as either or rather than and both. But May 68, the CGT immediately tried to negotiate with the government to establish their own legitimacy because they had been excluded, the Communist Party had been excluded from governments in France. So they were looking to get into the government, and in so doing, they really, not physically, but they attacked the popular movement and instructed workers in factories not to let students in when students went to the factories to talk with the workers. So if we can think somehow of the general strike and these popular insurgencies happening together, that's when the movement is strongest. Or let me give you another example. Very often, Nepal, Nepal is an incredibly complicated country divided by caste and language and geography, etc. But the way the movement finally abolished the monarchy was a combination of the Maoist armed struggle in the countryside and the popular movements inside the cities. That included the Congress Party, which is not a revolutionary force by any stretch of the imagination. But it was the combination of all of these sectors acting together that gave the movement its great strength. So I would hope that in the future, workers' general strikes, as in Gwangju, when there was indeed a general strike, everybody stayed off work to fight in the streets, but the unions, of course, did not exist at that time. They were government-sponsored unions, but the workers themselves overwhelmingly joined the movement. The workers in the biggest factory in Gwangju, which is an automobile factory, it still is there. It's got a different name today. But the workers delivered brand new armored cars to the insurgents. And in many cases, the people who built the cars on the assembly line drove the cars to deliver them to the movement. And Antti showed the slides of the burnt out buses and cars in the streets, I believe. So without anyone asking, the workers from the automobile factory brought their heavy equipment and cleared out all that rubble. And people, of course, by the thousands brought brooms and cleaned up the streets. But the point is, if the workers were, a popular uprising of necessity includes the working class. But the organizations that might call a general strike, trade unions, parties, are often against these uprisings because they don't control them. And if they don't control them and can't benefit from them, they're, so far at least.
Yeah, I understand. But the point is, so you agree that there needs to be an economical impact by having a spontaneous movement at the same time that stopping production at the same
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay, that's not.
In 1987 in South Korea, after the government capitulated and said, okay, we'll have direct elections, the largest strike wave in South Korean history happened. Antti has the PDF, but it's an amazing I talk about it in my book. It's an amazing strike wave that wins huge wage concessions, better working conditions, so that the two really have to be seen together. And in so many other uprisings that I discussed in Volume 2, general strikes by workers happen after the popular uprisings in order to win specific economic demands for workers. So by looking at the two together, one can see how they go hand in hand.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. My name is Keegan. I study China-related stuff and labor action in China, basically labor resistance and movements. I have a question about nationalism. I had sort of two questions about sort of nationalism and racism in East Asia. I guess one is just about East Asia in general, and the other about sort of Burma and Myanmar. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that in a second. But I'm wondering about, I suspect that nationalism especially has been on the rise in China over the past 2 decades. And as well today, especially if you look at the conflict between China and Japan over Senkaku Islands and these sorts of things, and I expect also in South Korea as well. I just wonder if, from your perspective of long historical view, if nationalism has in fact gotten much worse in response to these movements, post movements, as they were in the 80s compared to the 80s. And then I guess if you could talk a little bit about Burma and Myanmar, I'm a little curious on that same note, if the way that people, for example today, the treatment of the Rohingya has changed over time, and if this is sort of a racist, nationalist sort of mutation in the way that these people have been treated. There was a BBC article that said in protest about some Myanmar protests against Chinese building, and it said Myanmar something like learns how to protest or something like that. And to me, it must have been either, if it's anything, it's probably a remembrance, because I imagine, as you must know, there's a long history here. And if these movements have had different relationship to these minority groups or to stateless persons in particular in Myanmar. So just East Asia and Myanmar.
Those are important issues. I think you're right, nationalism, national sentiment is very important in the region. For over 100 years, the United States and Japan have ruled East Asia as their backyard. You know probably the 1905 Taft-Katsura Agreement, through which Korea was given to Japan and the Philippines to the U.S. And it wasn't only Korea that Japan took Manchuria, it took much of China. And the brutality of the Japanese actions can only be compared in the 20th century to what the Nazis did in Europe. And yet, Germany has to some extent denazified, paid reparations, acknowledged the Holocaust, and culturally educated its citizens to some extent. Japan has never been made to do that, nor has it been asked by the United States to do that. In fact, one of the worst aspects of Japanese treatment of human beings was its development of biological warfare on captured prisoners, including Americans, Australians, British, but mainly Chinese and Korean. After the war, Unit 731, as it was called, were brought to the United States, and the United States secured the germ agents that the unit had developed, used them in North Korea, in fact. But the point I want to get to here is that the current Prime Minister of Japan, Abe, recently unveiled as part of Japan's remilitarization new fighter jets. And those jets, he posed for a photo. I don't know if you've seen the photo. He's giving the thumbs up, smiling, and the number on the side of the jet is 731, which is the same unit number as that biological warfare team. That photo caused enormous heartache in China and Japan and Korea, as you can imagine, and not just South Korea, but the North Koreans, said, look, here it is. The United States is up to its old tricks. It's getting Japan to develop its military, and they're celebrating what they did. Abe's grandfather, who, everyone says was such a nice man and brought up his grandson so well, was a Class A war criminal who spent 5 years in prison. Although he was released without a trial by the United States, it's a very serious problem. So Japan claims islands near China, it claims islands near Korea, and the United States, of course, with the Chinese dispute is backing Japan. With the Korean one has made no determination, which really, even old Japanese maps, that is Japanese maps before the empire expanded, show those islands as belonging to Korea. And there's, perhaps I'm biased, but there should be no doubt that they belong to Korea historically. And Japan is just, in fact, believe it or not, this is a side note, you probably know this, the royal family of Japan can trace its roots to Korea, from the Paekje, the region of Korea that was defeated by Showa. The nobles sailed around Japan and became the royal family of Japan. That's like more than 1,000 years ago, and most Japanese people refuse to accept that, but it's, again, the evidence is overwhelming. So then, is Korean nationalism a problem? Right, if we can talk specifically about Korean nationalism.
Sure.
In a sense, it's a problem, but it's also got a very promising dimension to it. Namely, if the Korean peninsula can be reunited so that there is no war, I think that's a very positive thing. On the other hand, there are nationalists in the North and the South that want to unite the peninsula through war, and they believe, that's possible. So I can see it both ways. There's a strong peace movement in Korea that is nationalist and believes, the Koreans shouldn't be sacrificed. Again, with the capitalism's continual economic crisis, and Japan's now had 2 lost decades. Is a war in Korea, again, an option to rebuild the Japanese economy? It certainly did before. It got the Japanese economy going after World War II, and many Koreans are afraid of that. So, I think Chinese nationalism is similarly often a response in terms of Japan, to Japan, but there are other ways in which Chinese nationalism is a big problem. I've experienced it myself, and my late partner was Korean, and we traveled to many parts of China together because she couldn't get a visa to the U.S. for a long time, until we got married, actually. But we went to Yan'an. I don't know if you know where the Long March ended.
Yeah.
It's a very remote area of China, and very few Westerners, I think, had ever been there. And we were just treated terribly by Chinese people who, insisted, would come up to her and just say, "What are you doing with this white guy?" And she would say, "I'm not even Chinese, just leave me alone." But, that is absolutely an issue and a problem. Is it rising? It's hard to say. China is so big. But I'll tell you this. I spent a long time in Xinjiang, in Urumqi and Kashgar. And I was there as the riots started. We were leaving at the airport when Chinese or Han security guards and Uyghur Chinese security guards themselves got in a fight. These are the guys who were checking us as we go through security at the airport. They got in a fight. They were hitting each other with chairs, ripping each other's uniforms. And, you know, clearly are there ethnic divisions in China? Clearly terrible ones. Do Uyghurs feel they're being colonized? Absolutely they feel that way. Do Tibetans suffer under the boot of Chinese military control? Absolutely. But it's, again, it's a double-edged sword. I was lucky to go to Tibet because during the Olympics, when there were protests worldwide, Tibet was immediately closed down. And I was walking down the street in Kathmandu, and someone put out a board that said Tibet is open. And I, went right in, and within a day bought a ticket and went. And it was open through this very small window. And I was able to see the ways in which, sure, I'm aware and I write about the problems, but I was able to see the ways in which economic development has been amazing in Tibet. So in Kathmandu, when I left, there were lines of hundreds of motorcycles and 100 taxis at any gas station. And they were being, rationed. The petrol was rationed severely. I think it was 3 liters was all you could buy. And like Nepal, Tibet is landlocked, but there were empty gas stations all over the place where people could just drive in and fill up. There were unbelievable highways. Nepal's roads are, terrible. I don't know if anyone has been there, they can tell you about it. It's very difficult to get around the country. So, is modernization of that a good thing or not? But I can tell you that the contrast was striking. And then you said about Myanmar. I don't know if I'm answering your questions well. I'm kind of rambling, but I was in Myanmar recently, earlier this year, and I spent a lot of time with a Kachin person. That's Burma. Some people say that a minority of Burmese are Burmans, right? That the minorities are a majority when there are so many minorities in Myanmar. Now the monk who has spoken out and led many of the protests against the Muslims in the countries, what would that be? The countries west, definitely is, in some ways, I think, can we say racist? Because actually these people are not racially any different, as far as I understand. Religiously they're different, right? So he's,
one person called it a fascist. What was there? Some articles called it some groups there, they called it some form of Buddhist fascist or something like that.
Right, but I mean, isn't that taking Western categories and transposing them onto, I don't know. But I think it's certainly he's very prejudiced and compels people to act, and brutally. It's a very dynamic situation in Myanmar. People, as I spoke about Gwangju and I said how repression of knowledge was so severe, it's very much the case in Myanmar. I met with people from the so-called generation of '88. These are the people who did the protests in '88, and you're right, they're very capable organizers. Their status is super elevated on the streets. People in Burma are very religious, and they worship, in a way, their power, their government, but they also worship the people against the government who are willing to take risks. This generation of '88, when the riots happened, they sent a delegation, because I don't know if you heard about it, but in Malaysia, Burmese migrant workers were attacked in response by Muslims. And so they sent a delegation to Malaysia to publicly apologize for the violence in Burma and to call for international solidarity in the face of economic crisis. But the government of Myanmar has not done all that it should to contain the violence. The violence, I think, is useful. The government in Myanmar is not simply agreed on the path that the country is on toward greater openness. There are many generals who are against that path, and it's my understanding that they are the ones who control that region and are using ethnic violence as a wedge against the central government's attempt to limit their power and the military's power. So I think there's more to all of these questions than simply racism at the grassroots. I think they're all, they have to do a lot with power and national priorities.
Sure. Okay, thanks.
More?
Okay, one more question.
Hello, hi, my name's Dipsa.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Itza?
Something like that, yeah.
What's your name?
Pizza.
Itza.
Pizza. That's
Sorry.
don't worry, it's not relevant. Thank you anyway. I'll try to be brief. I wanted to ask you about, since I'm part of this generation that doesn't really remember anything about what you talked about, what happened in 2000-ish, during the time in Seattle and in different cities. And I guess the Arab uprisings, they haven't really reached Finland, for example, in the same way as they have reached some other countries. Neither has the Occupy movement so much. So I would just like to ask you what, because you were talking about this collective feeling and during these moments when people actually when these movements become uprisings, like what can we actually get from looking back to them? Because I have the only way to experience that is to hear people when they kind of go back to that time and they refer to it as something that is past and that's gone, but I guess there was this kind of sense of community at the time. So yeah, I wanted to ask, how could people what could people get from it afterwards? Because these are kind of brief moments in history that disappear, and I think a lot of it disappears with it when it's gone.
I understand what you mean, and what's the residue, what's left? I think, first of all, and I've spoken in many places about this, and people have agreed, lifelong friendships are formed. When you're in the streets with someone in these moments like this, and you're relying on them for your safety, but you're also experiencing those moments together, you form a bond that, it's not the kind of bond that is formed in a love relationship or in a family. But it's similar to that bond, but it's a bond of being part of history and a feeling that history can be changed. And so the ideas, the cause, if you want to call it the cause, is deeply embedded in people's psyche in those moments. And some people go a little bit crazy from it, right? And we've seen violence within movements because people become totally obsessed with the cause, and to the point where they even lose sight of their humanity. But it's been my experience when you're in the streets with somebody, it's the humanity part that becomes predominant, and not just meaning, but not just as one-on-one, but even, because if you are lucky enough to be part of a group during those moments, the group bond becomes unbelievably tight as well. And so that's one thing, right, or how we ourselves as individuals are changed in relation to other specific individuals who were in proximity to us. But there is then also this feeling of great international or global solidarity, so that when when I think hear about struggles in other places, I can relate to them on a gut level, that perhaps, I think very often ideas get in the way of that identification. Let me give you an example. I was in the UK recently, and I gave a talk, and I was saying how, we should all get beyond our particular ideologies and have a movement that is unified. And somebody said to me, well, wait a minute here. We're talking about, in the UK, there were vegetarians, vegan people, who would not march with British coal miners who were on strike because the British coal miners ate meat. And I said, look, there's a perfect example of how our ideologies can divide us and how we need to understand, that each of us as a human being, blah, blah, blah. You see what I'm saying? In the streets, in these moments, I think you have a life experience that, in other words, very often I think people who are especially sectarian have had little experience in the streets. That's my own observation. I couldn't prove it. Said, can you prove that? Because obviously people who have also been in the streets can become sectarian, but by and large, that's been my observation, that movements with little experience like that become ideologically rigid. So these uprisings build on each other. They create a capacity in broad numbers, masses of people to act. For instance, in the Philippines, there's that capacity that existed. There was People Power 2, People Power 3. In Nepal, there was the 1990 uprising, and there was one in 2006. In Thailand, there were uprisings in 1973, 1992, and then in recently, the red shirts and the yellow shirts, for instance, both of whom come out of those movements and are fighting each other, but both of whom have the skills, the networks, and the savvy to be able to have these kinds of movements. And then on a whole other level, I think internationally we assimilate the lessons. I think, how did Egyptian protesters know to seize Tahrir Square? It in part comes out of an intuitive understanding from having this, changed understanding of politics that we've seen since 1968, where public space is continually being seized by insurgent movements. So, obviously there are also gains that are won. In every case that I have studied, with the possible exceptions of Tibet and Burma, more independent media, more rights for women, more unions, more higher wages, and all of these things were won in the wake of these uprisings. So there were very tangible things that we can point to as well.
Okay, I definitely see what you mean. I guess also you talk quite a lot about violence as well.
Mm-hmm. How do you come to the movement?
How do I come to the movement?
Mm-hmm.
That's a very difficult question. I guess it's through social centers or the movement originally, but I mean, I was 13 when I decided, or maybe 12, when I decided to go to a demonstration that was, it was against the war in Iraq, and it's and the thing is now and afterwards I know that it was like the biggest one in Helsinki, like, well, since ages ago. I mean, there hasn't been that.
That was February 15th, 2003, right?
Yeah, that was. Yeah, and I wasn't really that old. I guess I didn't realize at the time how big an issue it was here as well.
There were millions of people all over the world that went into the streets on that day, right?
Yeah.
It could be thought of as one of those global moments, and it affected you, I think.
Yeah, I think for me it's something that kind of gained meaning afterwards, which is also interesting. But there's many events that have gotten their meaning, not only in that moment, but afterwards as well. Maybe because I was younger than most of.
Yeah. Did you go by yourself or with a group of people, a family?
I went by myself. I dragged a friend along, but she was more skeptical than I was. She's not here today, so.
But I think she's a good friend, no?
Yeah.
Yes. That experience together bring you closer to each other?
Possibly, yeah, I think so. And I think I can relate to that thing you said about cause and this collective work bonding. Sounds familiar, more than vaguely. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions? If not, then maybe we can talk about how you're untimid.
Keegan wants to know where we met, and Juho wants to know where we met.
Well, I'll let you handle that, Auntie.
So maybe have more fancy story of this.
Well, no, I'll let you. I'll let you deal with it, and you should, yeah. So it's been a pleasure to talk with you guys through the cyber connection. I hope one day to, Auntie, I know I'll see you again. I hope to, see you soon.